And I just want to welcome you all to our presentation today. We've got two very special speakers here talking about for those who like to go slow. And I'm really pleased to introduce both of them because they are not only wonderful and entertaining scientists, but they've also provided me with great guidance. And I'm sure they'll do the same for you. So if you can, just stay muted during the presentations, the button on the bottom left, and set your screen to speaker view, not gallery view. And if you have any questions, pop them into the chat box or hold them to the end, and we'll make sure to address as many as we can. And so without further ado, our first speaker, or the first presentation, which is pre-recorded, will be from Ken Bridle. He's a trained botanist who has historically had an emphasis on plant physiology in natural product chemistry, which he has his Ph.D. in, and has many years of experience and has worked as a natural heritage and watershed inventory biologist, a field ecologist, science museum exhibits director, environmental consultant, you name it. He knows the Piedmont very well. He's conducted local and regional conservation research and restoration projects in the Dan River area. He is from Walnut Cove, where he currently lives, and he's a founding member of the Dan River Basin Association. And he's been active with his current job at the Piedmont Land Conservancy in many roles there for over 20 years. And he's currently the stewardship director, responsible for easement monitoring and management of over 25,000 acres of land and 190 projects. And he's just a person you would love to hike with. And so let me make sure I share my screen appropriately. And get my audio shared. All right.
Good afternoon. I'm Ken Bridle, Stewardship and Inventory Director for the Piedmont Land Conservancy. And I've been asked to walk you through a little mindful moving through the Piedmont. The Piedmont is one of the physiographic regions of North Carolina, located in the center of the state, about 125 miles wide, from the mountains in the west to the coastal plain in the east. The sand hills, shown on this figure as a separate physiographic region, is actually an area with topography like the Piedmont, but sandy soils like the coastal plain. I've illustrated some of this talk with colorful watercolor paintings of my own, and this is our native poppy family plant bloodroot blooming about this time. The geology of the Piedmont determines the topography. Many of the plant communities and stream courses and other aspects like soils. You can see by this figure that there are several indicated zones of geology, including an inner and outer Piedmont belt, slate belts. The darker portions include the Triassic basins of sedimentary rock and some Piedmont mountain ranges and monadnocks. The view from one of these monadnocks, Pilot Mountain, in the western Piedmont, looking east at Sourtown Mountain and further on towards the horizon at Hanging Rock. The views from these monadnocks show the Piedmont looks like a flat plain. It's actually geologically a penny plain, which means eroded to a flatness, but still dissected by creeks and rivers. The topography in any local area might have as much as 150 feet of elevation from the lowest creek on a piece of property to the highest ridge. The elevation of the Piedmont in general is 1,500 feet in the west to about 300 feet in the east. The Piedmont has been settled by European colonists for about 300 years, by Native Americans for more than 8,000 years before that. But the Europeans were farmers and carved out small farms out of the forest by hand and with the aid of animals, plowed and tilled, sometimes on steep soils, until the soil wore out, then moved on to another tract. So there's been waves of clearing and resettlement all across the Piedmont for the last 300 years. Many of these family farms are still owned by the same families for 5, 6 or more generations. They keep the farms intact by agriculture, animal husbandry, and some forestry practices. Most are a mix. Most of the Piedmont is a mosaic of farms and fields. Many of the farms are family home places, and this one, is well maintained by some gentleman farmer who probably has an off-farm job, but still maintains the family farm because it's grandpa's farm. But there's no actual farming going on here anymore, just enough to keep the present use tax of agriculture or forestry. So a little tree cutting and a little hay. One of my favorite guides to the Piedmont is Michael Godfrey's Field Guide to the Piedmont. I like the subtitle, The Natural Habitats of America's Most Lived-In Region, from New York City to Montgomery, Alabama. This is a map of Forsyth County from 1927, showing the layout of the county pretty much before the advent of the automobile. The central towns of Winston and Salem combined, Salem being the historic Moravian settlement of the 1750s. The key part of this map is to show that there were a series of small crossroads communities and hamlets about every 7 miles apart in the Piedmont. That's the amount of distance you could walk to and back in a day. And larger communities about every 20 miles apart. That's the distance you could get by horse or wagon round trip in a day. This graphic shows the current development patterns in the Piedmont. This is the western Piedmont, with Charlotte as the red dot in the center. The tan area you see metastasizing across the landscape is the development. And you can see it's about 100 to 150 acres a day lost to development from the natural communities. It also shows the footprint of what every person requires, being somewhere between a half an acre and an acre of land per each person for the requirements of our modern life. And this is sort of what's left in the urban area. North Carolina is increasingly metropolitan in the arc from Charlotte up through Winston-Salem and Greensboro and Durham and Raleigh, called the Carolina Crescent, essentially one large urban area with some green space to the north along the Virginia border and some green space in the Uwharrie Mountains to the south of this. This is a watercolor of a pair of bluebirds on a red maple in the springtime. I learned about the Mountains to Sea Trail from Alan D. Hart's books, the Mountains to Sea Trail guides, which were mostly walking along roadways. Current Mountains to Sea Trail guides by segment are an improvement over Alan D. Hart's book in that they have more definition of the current route, and there's an increasing effort to try to get the route off the roads. In the Piedmont, since most of the land is private property, it's becoming more difficult to actually get the route off onto private property. But the guides have some very interesting they have a lot of information related to the logistics and camping and restrooms, but there's some basic information that I like to see, which is links to visitor centers, local towns, and points of interest. The photo at the bottom is taken by Joe Mickey, showing people hiking through the forest in Elkin on the Elkins Trail system. The Piedmont forests are actually a mixture of several dry communities, including oak hickory forest types that occur on the tops of the ridges and the sunny southern slopes. And there also are moisture-loving and shade-loving communities on the north sides of the slopes and down in the valley. To most people, natural communities are kind of an abstract thing where they see a big green wall of oaks or pines that they can identify, and then just a smattering of other colors of flowers and things, and not really knowing much about them. I recommend the Wildflowers and Plant Communities Guide, recently published. It has good descriptions of mountain and Piedmont natural communities where plants that occur together on certain parts of the topography are well described. And you can learn about 3 different kinds of dry forests that occur in the Piedmont and 3 different kinds of wet forests that occur in the Piedmont and where they occur. And once you understand plant communities, that's a key to learning to read the landscape. Whether we're talking about small wildflowers that occur only in the spring or late summer wildflowers in open meadows and all of the insects that inhabit them, you can also be interested in birding. You'll see lots of birds while hiking along the trail. The Wildlife Commission in North Carolina and Audubon have put together Piedmont birding trail guides. Also, there's a coastal plain and a mountain. While not strictly a trail, they do have locations of publicly accessible wildlife viewing areas. In this map, you can see the green dots in the northwest Piedmont. That's Hanging Rock and Winston-Salem. Then you progress through Greensboro and Durham into the greater Raleigh-Durham area. So there are places that you can see wildlife that are well known and accessible by the public. There are other guides that are useful to understanding some of the other wildlife that you'll run into along the trail, including the butterflies through binoculars, which allows you to watch butterflies and learn more about their behavior and habitat, as opposed to the old school net them and put them in kill jars and pin them on boards. There's also recently been published a very nice guide to the mushrooms of the Carolinas, and I include this in the talk because it harkens back to the Moravian church administrator David von Schweinitz, who was the father of American mycology and was published the first guide to the mushrooms of the Americas in 1831. Other useful things that you can add to your phone are bird guides like Sibley's Birds or eBird or Merlin ID birds, which are very good guides to have. There's also a pocket-sized Flora of Virginia that is based on Alan Weekly's Flora, and as soon as they put out a North Carolina version, we'll be using that. If you want to dig deeper, there's a North Carolina Biodiversity Project, which has species lists and web pages for 20 groups of plants and animals, and some of these lists can be location specific. I also always recommend iNaturalist for both identification purposes and reporting of your finds along the. I want to thank you for your interest in appreciating the world around you. If you have any further questions about this talk or land conservation in the Piedmont in general, you can contact me at piedmontland.org or the phone number listed above.
All right, so I'm going to go ahead and just suggest that we hold our questions until the very end so that we can make sure both presentations get in. And so next we'll be hearing from Julie Moore. And Julie Moore is a trained botanist and endangered species biologist with many years of experience working all throughout the Southeast. And she has worked for the North Carolina Natural Heritage Program and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services headquarters as the coordinator of the Safe Harbor Program. She currently sits on the board of the North Carolina Plant Conservation Program and is hard at work advocating for the Venus flytrap through the recently formed Venus Flytrap Champions organization, who will be putting out website and pamphlets or brochures soon. So I'm sure she'd love to talk to you about that. Additionally, she is this year's Illustrious Palustris Award winner, given annually by the Longleaf Coalition in recognition of outstanding contributions to promote the maintenance and restoration of North Carolina's longleaf pine ecosystem. And I will get this going. All right, Julie, are you there?
I'm here.
Okay, you let me know when you want me to move the screen forward.
Will indeed. You mentioned early on when we started this series we're talking about that I was going to say a lot about longleaf. Well, I don't have a long time to talk about longleaf today, so I'm just going to hit the highlights and encourage you all to learn more, and perhaps in the future we can be together in some longleaf forest, which are something that I became intrigued with my early days with the Natural Heritage Program. And I'll tell you why. At the time, there was so little longleaf left in anywhere. And we were really just trying to raise awareness of this species. Here it was, one of the most important commercial trees known in the United States, with 90 million acres from Virginia to Texas. And there was very little left of it. The story has improved, I'm glad to say. If you change the slide for me. The picture of me when we, on the side panel, has me in front of cypress trees. Cypress trees and pines aren't very similar. The longleaf is the pine with big cones and the really long needles. Very distinctive look to it, has heavy branches, and now we see most of it left in the sandhills, but one time it covered most of eastern North Carolina and the southeastern United States. Okay. This range map gives you an idea of the extent of longleaf from eastern Virginia into Texas, and it shows here in North Carolina how much of the state was covered by longleaf at one time, except for the swamps. Really, most of the coastal plain was actually dominated by longleaf pine forests. Here we can see several different associations in different parts of the state. So we do have a good bit of diversity in these longleaf stands. And Ken mentioned different plant communities. These are be very distinctive plant communities. So they're dominated by one tree, depending on what the soil is like and how much moisture there is. Next, please. We have longleaf all the way from the Uaris that you see down there with that nice big rock, all the way through the sandhills and into the Piedmont, and I mean from the Piedmont east, and then all the way into the outer coastal plain, where the topography is pretty flat. Sandhills are hilly, and the montane or Piedmont longleaf actually has a lot of rocks in it. The tree is the same, but the understory is different. But basically, these areas are pine dominated, but with a grassy ground cover. This is what the early settlers saw when they came to the South. And many of them wrote that they could actually ride through and take wagons through this forest with no problem, because there wasn't much but big trees and a lot of grasses and the many associated species we'll talk about in a minute. Some are flat, some are hilly. They're all grass dominated originally. And what's kept this grass characteristic was fire. Longleaf is driven by fire. And if you looked at a map that really showed lightning strikes, the whole area that's was dominated by longleaf was the highest incidence of lightning generated fires in the United States, other than the far west. Without incredible regular burning, we lose a lot of the components of this forest. But the pines you can see there, those little seedlings survive just fine. Once they're about an inch in diameter right at the ground, they can take the fire. This is called the bottle brush stage. And those hardwoods behind hopefully will be cut back or pruned back so they won't outcompete the pines as they mature. Next. How quickly, could you go back one? How quickly the pines needles generate such a nice hot fire, and the grasses spawn so quickly. These were taken, a picture was taken outside the place I lived in Georgia that was burned regularly. And within 3 days after a fire, this is how fast the grasses were coming back. Recovery of this system and the response to fire is just about instantaneous. The next one, please. This is one of my favorite photos. This is a seed of longleaf that's just germinated. And notice the bare soil here. The cones are produced almost every year, but have bumper crops of cones about every 7 years. And the needles, the seeds begin to fall out of the cones in the fall. And they, with that nice wing, they parachute, I guess you'd say, to the ground. And this one, as soon as the seeds hit the bare soil, they begin to germinate. And that's the future little pine there underneath the seed. Well, what happened to this forest? Well, naval stores, tar and pitch. Why are we called the Tar Heels? This industry was huge, starting in Virginia and going throughout the South. In North Carolina, it was the biggest industry for many decades in the 1700s, 1800s. And in this case, they're actually tapping the trees for resin that will be taken away to a distillery and refined to make turpentine. We also had people who made pitch, which was a simpler process. But this was a huge industry in North Carolina and throughout the South. Amazingly enough, many of those trees can survive that kind of scarring as long as there's some natural bark in parts of it left around the tree. But it also could catch fire pretty easily. This is a typical scene along many of the rivers in North Carolina when the resin would be taken, collected in barrels, and taken to the distillery, and then shipped down to the ports along the North Carolina coast and the coast throughout the South. As I keep saying, it was a big industry. What happened next to this wonderful forest was, particularly with the advent of trains, you could actually get these beautiful logs, once again, to the coast to be shipped around. So we had the tar and turpentine production. Then we had the whole industry of the lumber industry. And this is really the forest that built America. You can actually, parts of what was the Brooklyn Bridge were actually made out of longleaf that was shipped from the eastern seaboard. Next, please. And this was what a hell of a lot of the South looked like. After the turpentining, after the harvest of the timber, and you see the old stobs left there. When I got to Mississippi, I was amazed that in 1900, this is what so much of Mississippi looked like. But fortunately, a lot of those pine trees before they were cut had produced seeds, and in many cases, this landscape actually restored naturally. On to the next one. So that was a tragic story of what happened. And when I got into this business of looking at longleaf and being interested, people thought it was a dead forest type. Why should we talk about it? One tree, not very diverse. But the most exciting thing happened by a woman named Joan Walker, who was at UNC. And she did her Ph.D. work in the green swamp in the early 80s. And she determined something that was the game changer, shall we say, in the conservation of this forest type. The green swamp, that's the wonderful pitcher plants of the green swamp where she worked. Next, please. Well, you can't quite read these statistics because our faces are in front of them, but this is a map produced by NatureServe, and the higher number of species, the brighter the colors, the yellow. And you can see the sandhills and the coast of North Carolina, and even going into Virginia, following that bright yellow is basically the range of longleaf. And that has to do a lot with more fires, more species diversity. And where Joan was doing her PhD work, for the first time that anybody really knew how many plant species were in the system. Yeah, right there, great. And we knew about some of the animals, but no one had ever recorded the high diversity of plant species. And the first statistic that came out of it years ago was in a meter square, you could count 40 different species. That's not 40 plants, that's 40 different species of plants. And sometimes you'd have 2 or 3 of some and just 1 of others. But the fire was the leveling agent that made these species be able to compete with each other for their space in the sun underneath those majestic big pine trees. Today we have many federally listed species, both plants and animals, and how many, not only plants, which are my business, but all of the frogs, snakes. It's just a high diversity system. And this was surprising to people for many years because we always thought of things like the Amazon, or even in the southeast, the mountains, you had a high diversity of trees. In this case, the diversity in longleaf is on the ground, underneath the trees. Next one. Well, those zoologists had done a pretty good job early on documenting some of the things they were interested in these forests. And not only do you have quail and typical things, but you also have a lot of interesting snakes. And further south, starting in South Carolina, you also have tortoises. And there on the right, you can see the fox squirrel. This is a very system has a high carrying capacity for wildlife. There's a lot for them to eat, and there's enough cover for them to do very well. Um, most of these species um, thrive if there's enough fire. Next slide. The animal that caused the attention early on for the longleaf forest because it was in such sad shape was a red-cockaded woodpecker. And this was quite controversial when I got into this business. And take a look at that tree over there on the whole tree. That white color is caused by the pecking of the woodpecker on the tree. The red-cockaded woodpecker uses only live trees, and they excavate these cavities in them. You can see how much sap is around that, and that'll keep the snakes and some of the other birds away. And this one, you can actually see its little bracelets. Can you see the pink and white and blue? So many of these birds have now been tagged, and we know how they move. This is the most studied bird in the world today, what's called a mark recapture study. And so much started in the sandhills. But when you drive through or walk through, what you all are going to do through these forests, look for these white trees. If you're on public land, a lot of times they have white bands painted on them, and that's easy to see. Plant diversity is fascinating in this system, and that's what, as I mentioned with Joan's work, what we began to really see the number of species there. And it's many very rare ones are in this system. And as you go through, depending on the time of year, you're going to see a whole lot of different plant species coming and going. There's almost always something blooming in these forests, maybe in the very dead of winter, but then the pixie moss comes out. So there's almost always something to enjoy in this forest system. A lot of them are perennials right on the ground. And now and then you do have the small shrubs like the blueberries and huckleberries and a few other things that don't get too tall to compete with the other species. Next slide. That pretty picture, that lily in the middle, the one with the bug on it, the insect, the praying mantis, that's a newly described species from the longleaf forest. Bruce Story described it just about not even 10 years ago. People had known it, but they didn't have a name for it. This is the fire lily, and it grows within habitats that are burned regularly. It extends from Virginia into South Carolina. It's a very majestic lily, and we actually have a whole preserve dedicated in the sandhills to the fire lily. Its name is Lilium pyrophyllum, fire-loving. The diversity of these other species is, you can see another lily down there. It's one that's only about knee-high. It's a very common to see something, as I said, blooming at all times. It may be the most diverse part of this is like where Joan did her work in the Green Swamp, is the savannas areas, the flat, moist areas, right along the, just inside from the coastal plain. When you all are going to be on some of these trails that you're working, which basically longleaf, everything east of Goldsboro was longleaf at one time, actually east of 95. And the different communities, as Ken pointed out so well, with the different moisture gradients and the different soil types really foster different plant species. And this one is just amazing how many wonderful orchids are in the savannas with that beautiful little seedling right there. Fire is the key to keeping these things there. The species that that Ben mentioned that I'm particularly interested in these days is the Venus flytrap. And we now had new surveys done, and we know how rare it's becoming. At once in the 30s, you could still find a lot of them. The epicenter is from Wilmington, about 90 miles inland, and south into South Carolina. With sea level rise and the development of the coastal plain, I think it's time for us to really work on this species. It's proposed for federal listing, but we need to do something before that. And I'm working to engage private landowners in the conservation of this, as well as on the public lands like Camp Lejeune and the Croatan National Forest. So stay tuned on the flytrap front. When you're walking, keep your eyes open. These are the old recovered, one on the left is dead, but that was one of the turpentine scarred tree called cat faces. And this one on the right with the metal gutters that would guide the resin into buckets. That tree is still alive, amazingly enough. And you can find a lot of these in the landscape as you make your way through the longleaf area when you're on your adventures in the coastal plain. And you find these beautiful totems. Because of how dense the resin is in these trees, they really can stay up forever. Have any of you all ever bought or even collected light wood or lighter wood to start fires with? That's what this tree produces after it's gone on to its next life. And they stay, fortunately, because of that, they're so hard and resin rich that that I call it a totem could be there for another 50 or 60 years. What we see today going on is another product. We've talked about naval stores and timber production. And the other thing that's happening today, and many of you who are gardeners probably know, this is pine straw, which is a very valuable resource and selling like mad at your local garden stores. So that comes from longleaf forest. And the more you burn them, the easier it is to get the straw. Okay, next one. I've emphasized this before. Taking the fire out of the longleaf forest is like taking the rain out of the rainforest. Next, please. Two books. Ken gave you all a lot of good books and guides to butterflies and all kinds of things, but here are two that you really need if you're interested in longleaf. One was a book written by my good friend Larry Early, Looking for Longleaf, The Fall and the Rise of the American Forest. When Larry started his book, it was all about the loss of the longleaf forest, but as he worked on it for about 10 years, the picture changed, and there's more work going on longleaf all the time now, and people are interested. But this gives a good history, talks about turpentining. It goes all through the range, and I really do advocate that if you're interested in backstory and the future story of longleaf. And for the little plants that you see, Bruce Sorey's book, recently published by North Carolina Press, both of these are North Carolina Press, is The Flowers of the Sandhills regions, and that'll carry you all the way down to the coast. And that is the fire lily that Bruce named. Next, please. I hope while you all are out in this forest, and it's beautiful any time of year, that was Christmas one year, there's something to see, whether it's the turpentine trees or the animals and what you hear and what you see underfoot. It's a fascinating forest, and the more you understand it, the more intrigued you'll be, and truth to tell, the slower you'll go. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julie. That was great. And I know that we're going to have some questions in the chat. Let me go ahead and see what I can pull up. All right. Let's see. So I don't see any new messages in the chat about questions. So now's your chance to hear from the experts. What I would say is we have about 12 minutes, but we can go a little longer if we need to.
Flowers in the last picture, the landscape one, those were huckleberries and blueberries that were bright red. Did you mean a flower or just the leaves? That's what I was talking about.
You want me to pull it back up, Julie?
Sure. That when she said last, I didn't know if she meant the picture of the lily on the book, which or the just in that shot, that winter picture.
So I have a question for you, Julie. If you had a place to recommend on the trail to go and see longleaf pine, what would be the place you would recommend? Or even if it's not necessarily on the trail.
The area that you and I have been talking about a good bit around Bladen Lakes, that area is intriguing. Where we hope to put the trail that was mentioned earlier was through the preserve, the plant conservation program preserve there in Sampson County. That is a very good area to see longleaf, and it's quite expansive stands that are being regularly burned, and that's a good place. And if you're anywhere near the Croatan, on the Croatan National Forest is another great place to see longleaf and also see all those insectivorous plants that are there. And if you're on the edge of Camp Lejeune, sometimes you can see some really amazing things in that area. Camp Lejeune kept burning when many places in the 20s and 30s stopped burning, and these forests, I'll just say, got shrubbed up and you couldn't see much. The military did keep burning, and so that's another good area to see these unusual, not only the trees, but the different types of soil types that give you different vegetation.
Weymouth Woods is also a good publicly accessible area, and they do a lot of burning there. So
I didn't know if the trail doesn't go through there. I don't think, though, does it? Does it?
No.
But yes, certainly Weymouth Woods is a state preserve there on the south side of Southern Pines.
Oh, that's great. And we have a question where someone asks about the twists in the totem from your presentation, Julie, and they look like old chestnuts. Is there anything particular about the pine's morphology that causes that?
I don't know.
It turns out a lot of plants do that. So hemlocks and a lot of other trees grow in that kind of helical fashion. So you see that a lot in a lot of trees. It's just the way, the geometry of the way trees with fixed plant cells divide. That's how the meristem turns as it goes up.
Twist actually gives them more strength to stand up, as I've been told, that it just goes straight up. That don't have quite the ability to withstand winds. The thing we have learned in the last 10 or 15 years, particularly since Hurricane Katrina, is that longleaf stands up better to hurricanes and tornadoes than any other tree. And that was found because we had plantings in Mississippi side by side of longleaf, loblolly, and slash, and pond pine. And so we could actually count after the hurricane how many of what species survived. So that's, if it hadn't had that survivability, and those twists may help, they would have wouldn't have dominated the southeast with the acreage that was there. It stands up to these forces. People used to say longleaf was a tree of the past. Well, truth to tell, it's a tree of the future. It can take fire, it can take wind, it can take drought, it can take all these conditions that are going to be changing for us as climates vary through time. So when people say, should we bother to plant longleaf? I'll say, yes, you should.
And as a follow-up to that, there's a question regarding pine maturity, but I'm gonna throw this to Ken and Julie. Maybe you can describe to people, Ken, for the Piedmont, how long does it take for a typical Piedmont forest to mature? And then Julie, after that, you can talk about the longleaf pine.
It actually depends on who you ask. If you ask a forester, they think it's mature when it's harvestable. And that's about probably 25% of the age that it would be when it climaxes out and maximizes. So most of our forests in North Carolina have been cut probably 3 times, maybe even 4 times. In the Piedmont, I find larger trees in urban areas because in the rural areas, the farm people cut the trees every generation as part of grandma's retirement plan or whatever, whereas people who live or work near urban areas have an off-farm job and can keep their big trees. So in general, it probably takes about 100 to 150 years for an oak forest to become a mature with all of the canopy parts and all the understory. And every time you cut it, you lose about 25% of the biodiversity in the next round. So the more you cut a forest, the more depauperate it gets as you regenerate. So there are some things, once you cut a forest, some things will never come back. So the other issue that happens in the Piedmont is the big blocks of forest get cut into little fragments. So we basically have a lot of edges and a lot of woodlots that are thin, and you can see from one side to another. So there's no deep, dark interior forest anymore that creates its own climate and moisture and soils. And so we have a lot of edges in the Piedmont. So and the species that like edges, like white-tailed deer and possums and things like that. That's the majority of the large wildlife. So we don't have things that like interior, dark, deep woods. Those are the ones that are kind of rare. So it takes hundreds of years for forests to mature, and most of the time we don't let them get that old.
Right.
Not we, but I mean the forestry community.
I'm sure that contrasts a lot with the longleaf pine, right, Julie?
Yes. But I was already thinking on a different subject. Fortunately, with longleaf, if the soil hasn't been cropped before, in many cases, you can get a lot of the ground cover species to come back. And you know, what's a mature forest? Well, to me, a mature forest is when it has the components. It's not so much the age of the trees, it's when everything returns. And as Kim was saying, with the Piedmont, it's hard to get all the components because it's fragments. But with some of the longleaf areas we still have, they're big enough that it isn't so much the age of the tree, but how often it's burned and what the structure is. What you want is those big tall trees and not much in between, and then the high ground cover diversity. And you can kind of get that in some cases within about 40 or 50 years. Structure-wise, not age-wise.
In the Piedmont, we would have had another large important pine called the shortleaf pine that would have been dominant in the Piedmont, and it's a fire-dependent Piedmont tree, and we don't have it very much because they were all cut out early, and now mostly what you see is early succession Virginia pines, which have short life and very little other than pulp value. So the Forest Service now has a program to try to promote shortleaf pines in the Piedmont, and they require fire. So, you know, it's the most developed, most residentially lived in landscape, and we're trying to do fire in the Piedmont because it's good for oak forests, because you regenerate a lot of little baby oaks when you burn a lot of that oak leaf off. But it's also good for getting rid of the Virginia pines by fire and allowing the shortleaf pines to grow. They're the ones that'll live for 300 or 400 years, whereas a Virginia pine dies after about 60.
Wow. And so speaking of that, we have another question regarding replanting campaigns. So if one of our members or someone was interested in helping with doing reforestation work in the Piedmont, or I'll start with you, Julie, in the Sandhills area, is there a group or someone that they could reach out to?
Yes, we have several different organizations. Certainly, one of them, we have a group called the Longleaf Coalition, and we have a website, and that's to we recognize landowners who are doing a good job. But also, there's a group that I've been involved with for years.
Audio's low.
Would be interesting to take a look at the website is the Longleaf Alliance, and that has a tremendous number of publications, short ones, long ones, about growing longleaf if you want to reestablish it. And longleaf really grew right here in Raleigh on the south side of town, and so also in the Uaris. So don't think you have to be in the flat area. You can be on the edge of the Piedmont and certainly do well. Or if you got a big rock area and there's nothing much growing on it, you might even tuck a few longleaf in there. It wouldn't be commercial, but it would be appropriate.
We have a North Carolina Prescribed Fire Coalition, which is another group that promotes fire both in longleaf and other things. And for example, there's a federally endangered sunflower that grows in the Piedmont, named after David von Schweinitz, that Moravian botanist. And it only grows in disturbed areas and is native to fire controlled areas. So you find it along roadsides and in areas where people are burning in the Piedmont. So one of our endangered species in the Piedmont in general, most of our endangered species are endangered because of habitat loss, like wetland species where we've been draining wetlands for 300 years, or lack of the right kind of management like fire. So the vast majority of the endangered species are endangered because of the way we're changing the habitat.
And real quick, so it's just now about to be 4:15, and so anyone's welcome to stay as long as our speakers do to answer questions, but we will be wrapping up shortly, and there's no need to stay for the main room. This will conclude the gathering events for today, but I did want to ask you, Ken, there's a question from Kate who wants to get your thoughts on our work around Belews Lake, and if there's anything in particular you want to say about that area, since you're so intimately familiar with it.
Belews Lake is a very interesting lake. Belews Creek is a drainage of the Roanoke River basin. It drains into the Dan River. And it was a very deep valley and had very interesting high pH soils. So when I did the natural heritage inventory back in the 90s, we were looking for a lot of interesting rare plants around Belews Lake, but we realized that most of them had been flooded and buried by that lake. Nowadays, it's a big block of land. Duke owns all the land around it. It does look like on a map, it should be a connector between Hanging Rock, Walnut Cove, the Dan River on one side, and the Oak Ridge, Summerfield, Greensboro on the other side. But on one direction, you have to get around a coal ash pond, and you can imagine that that's a sensitive area. And then on the other side, you got to get around the area below the dam, and there's a big spillway. And I mean, both of those areas, the company wants to keep people away from. So, you know, you're trying to think about, here's a lake, you would think, oh yeah, let's put a trail around it. Well, you got a spot on one side where you got coal ash you got to stay away from, and you got the dam below that, which is the biggest green block. You got to stay away from that. So I'm not entirely sure how we connect there. The Piedmont Land Conservancy owns a nature preserve right next to it, which is actually just in the Stokesdale area. And from there, there's actually a railroad trail that will go into Greensboro. So if you can get to the east side of Belews Lake, but going around one side, you get the dam, and one side, you get the coal ash pond. So it's going to be a little logistically touchy to try to figure out how to do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so historically, from what I understand so far of that area, there was a little community, a community called Little Egypt that was displaced by the lake. And then additionally, it's a really interesting geologic area because of the way the Dan River makes an immediate 90-degree turn. I believe that's a result. It's to the end of the Triassic Basin there.
That's the start of the Triassic Basin. Yeah, the Dan River comes out of the Blue Ridge Parkway and heads basically southeast through Virginia and then in through Stokes County. And right at Walnut Cove, it drops into the Triassic Basin, and then it turns northeast and it flows back out into Virginia because it has fallen into this Triassic sediment soils. So the river changes from a rocky, rapid and riffle-dominated system to a wide, narrow Piedmont stream right at that spot where they put the lake. So,
okay. Well, thank you so much for sharing. And if anyone has follow-up questions, please feel free to reach out to me or Julie or Ken, and we can get you connected with some of those resources, the books they mentioned and the guides they mentioned, so that you guys are ready to go and take it slow on the trail. And we're just so happy you joined us today. We're really proud of everything we're doing at the MST, and it's a perfect place for you to learn more about the ecology and the history of the state. So thank you both for sharing that and spending your time with us today.